Hello students! Today we're going to be talking about Dunn and Halonen Chapter 11, which is really what you can do with an advanced degree in psychology. So essentially some of the jobs that you can get with a master's or a doctorate in psychology. It's not an exhaustive list that we're going to talk about. We'll talk about kind of the different types or schools of psychology, but really we're going to have just a brief overview of some of the types of positions you can get with either a master's or a doctorate degree. So let's jump into that. And the first thing is, why would you want to go to grad school? So you maybe have an associate's in psychology, you have a bachelor's in psychology. Why would you want to get a master's or even a doctorate in psychology? So there's a couple different reasons. One of the things that it might be is because you want to be the person in charge of whatever kind of programs are being run. So at a bachelor's or an associate's level, you might be working under a psychologist. But in the past, it was really people with the PhDs or the doctorate level training that were called psychologists. More recently now, it's masters and doctorates. So they're the ones that are the full psychologists. So their job title would be psychologist. And they're the ones that will be planning out treatment programs, planning out clinical interventions, community interventions, things like that. Those people are going to have master's or doctoral level training. So if you want to do the work and be working within a community or a clinical population, there are positions you can get doing that with, say, an associate's or a bachelor's in psychology. But if you want to be the one that's really in charge of like doing the treatment and working with people and planning how to best serve them, that you're going to need to go on for master's level training. So with a lot of these master's level trainings, and we'll talk specifically in the next chapter about what goes into the different grad school programs in a little more detail, but just briefly, in a lot of these programs, you'll want to focus on what kind of job you want after the master's program, because depending on what it is, if you want to go into academics, so like be a school counselor or something, there might be specific certifications you need in addition to just the master's degree. And so depending on the program, you'll probably get that on your way to the degree and fulfill those requirements. So just make sure, because it could be frustrating. You finish your master's degree, you go to apply for a job, and you find out, oh, I need to do this additional certification, which you could do that way. But oftentimes, planning ahead, you can get that certification done throughout the coursework that you're doing. So if you want to be an actual psychologist, have that in your job title, probably master's level training or doctorate level training is what you're going to be shooting for. So what are these different degrees? An MA is Master of Arts, and it's pretty similar to a BA, so that was Bachelor's of Arts, and we talked about that a few chapters ago. So it's a little more liberal arts focused. You'll have more writing classes, you'll have maybe philosophy classes, maybe other classes in the social sciences that you might not get in an MS of psychology. So a Master of Science in Psychology, that's again a little more similar to a BS of Psychology. So it's a little more science and research focused. So just like we talked to bachelor's level training, you would be taking maybe additional biology classes, additional math classes that you wouldn't be required to in a BA. It's kind of the same thing. For a Master of Science, you'll probably get a little more statistics training versus a Master of Arts. You'll probably get a little more writing training. So depending on what kind of program you go into might matter if you want to go into a doctoral level training. But if you want to apply to a job that requires a master's in psychology, not going into doctoral programs, just going into a job that requires that master's in psychology, it's not going to put you really over the top if you have the Master of Arts or Master of Science degree. The big thing will be the skills you gain through it. So looking at what the program offers, the kind of coursework that they have, will help you figure out what kind of training they're focusing on. And then trying to pick out, maybe through interviewing people through your bachelor's degree who are in the field, seeing what's required in that kind of position, what kind of skills they think you need, looking at maybe job postings that you might look at when you're done with a master's and say, oh, okay, they're saying I need these kinds of skills with statistics. Then you might want to choose a Master of Science degree. Versus you might want to choose Master of Arts degree if you want more broad spectrum of social science training. So look for what kind of job, what kind of training you might need, and pick if you're going to do an MA or an MS based on that. So with this, the training and skills gained are different. A lot of the coursework is going to be very similar. So the psych-focused coursework is going to be pretty similar in the MA or MS, but it's going to be the additional like requirements, like what are the capstone project for an MA is probably going to look a little bit different than in an MS program. So maybe you have to do a master's thesis and actually do some research in the Master of Science program, versus the MA, you might be writing a paper, or you might be doing, say, an internship or a training experience or something like that. So it can matter in the real world in the sense that you're getting different skills in these different programs. But when you're applying to a job that just requires a master's, it's probably not going to put you over the top to have the MA or MS on your resume. So it won't really matter which one you have there. It's going to be more down to the skills that you're gaining. So figure out the kind of skills that you need or you want to determine that. Now, if you want to go on to a doctoral level training, so a PhD, that's going to be really, really research focused. And so if that's the case, if that's the path you want to take, getting the MS is probably going to get you a lot more training that's going to be relevant for that later doctoral training. We'll talk about some other doctoral programs too, like a PsyD is a more clinically focused doctoral degree, and so an MA would be totally appropriate for that. And so either having an MA or an MS for applying to a PsyD program, probably just fine. But if you're going to go the research route, I would definitely recommend the MS. But for a job with just the master's level training required, either one is probably going to be good. Just determine what skills you're going to need to determine which kind of program you go into. And that should be what you do when you're choosing any graduate program. Talk to students that are currently there, faculty that are there while you're going through the application process to determine, hey, I have maybe these 4 schools I could go to. Which ones am I going to get the most useful training from for the skills that I want to build? And make your decision based on that, and probably obviously costs and things like that too. So what are some of the positions that you might get with a master's degree in psychology, either the Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science? So in higher education, maybe teaching community college, kind of like this video is right here. I've currently got my master's level training, and hopefully by the end of this semester or this school year, I'll have that doctoral level training finished. But with the master's level training, I'm qualified to teach community college. Also university level as well as an adjunct teacher. So academic advising or recruiter, you can do that as well if that's of interest to you. Career counselor, there's a lot. We've talked in this class a lot about how many different fields could use psychologists. So this goes here in human services related jobs, human resource management, parole officer, rehabilitation counselor, vocational rehabilitation specialist, substance abuse counselor. So if one of these is something that's your goal, check and see what kind of certifications you need and if you can get those in whatever programs you're working on with your master's. So having that kind of network and connection and plan from the beginning will make sure you get whatever additional certifications you need, as well as the master's degree. So other things that you can do in the business world, human resource manager. So there's HR departments in some companies that are incredibly enormous. So any position there could be a really good fit for someone with psychology training. Employee developer, hiring managers, marketing specialists, public relations, project managers, sales representatives, store managers. So a lot of these things you might hear and say, oh, well, these are things that you can do without the master's level training in psychology as well. And some of them is absolutely true. And some of these, having that master's level degree will make you a better candidate for a lot of these too. So there's a lot of different things you can do with that master's level degree in psychology. So in clinical context, like I said, in this case with the master's level training and the certifications that you're getting along the way, you're qualified to basically be in charge of the treatment of individuals or groups as well. So behavioral counselor, mental health coordinator, mental health technicians. So with this, they're talking in this picture, the elements of a treatment plan. You might be creating that treatment plan with the master's level training versus with the bachelor's level training. You might implement some elements of that treatment plan but have no authority or training to modify the treatment plan. Therapist, rehabilitation specialist, you can definitely be a therapist with master's level training. So a counselor, these kinds of things at the master's level. And one good thing about master's level trainings is you can find programs that can be done in as little as 1.5 years. On average, most master's programs are about 2 years, so anywhere from 1.5 to 3 years is about what you will see for master's level programs. So a little bit quicker than a doctoral degree, that's for sure. So group home supervisor, child protection specialist, child care program manager. And here's kind of a breakdown of the percentage. I didn't mark what year this data was from, but it's stayed pretty consistent. So about 25% at universities or colleges who have a master's in psychology, hospitals or other health services, government VA medical centers, businesses and nonprofits. So this is similar to what we saw in bachelor's level trainings as well. Businesses and nonprofits are still pretty large, but medical centers as well as colleges and universities are some of the places that people with master's level training tend to work. But independent practice is also possible. Obviously with that, you'd probably want business training as well to open up an independent practice, that kind of thing, or have be working with a team who's opening up an independent practice. So traditionally, I mentioned this a little earlier, traditionally the title of psychologist was reserved for people with that doctoral training. So more recently, it's also people who have the master's level training, but I also think that this little image is interesting. We'll come to that in a second though. So with the Doctor of Philosophy degree, that's the Doctor of Philosophy degree is what PhD stands for. Philosophy, a Doctor of Philosophy in Psychology, a Doctor of Philosophy in Physics, a Doctor of Philosophy in Biology. So, and really it's the philosophy of science in that realm. So a doctorate in positive developmental psychology is a doctor of the science, the philosophy of science in positive developmental psychology. So it's a very research focused degree. So PhD is very, very research focused. The final project, your dissertation, is literally your own research that you are doing under the supervision of advisors. So, but you really need to enjoy, and we'll talk about this next chapter, really what the programs are like and what to expect from both master's and PhD programs, but it's very, very research heavy. So depending if it's a PhD in clinical psychology, you will be getting clinical training throughout there, and you will be certified to do clinical interventions as well. But you're also going to be doing research on different clinical interventions, maybe on a new or modified versions of cognitive behavioral therapy, or using or having this medicine in addition to this therapy, or some new kind of therapy for reducing arachnophobia. So you'll be doing research on these types of therapies and learning the science behind how we build and create therapies. So it's a very, very research focused degree. So if you like research, it's a great degree. If you don't like research, think more about the master's degrees, or we'll talk about it in a second, a PsyD. So with that being said, I do want to mention how grad school for a PhD is just like being in kindergarten. And this is funny to me because my child is in kindergarten. They don't actually have naps in kindergarten for him, but oftentimes you're working so long or so late, you'll end up having to take a nap or fall asleep at your computer. Constant adult supervision in kindergarten, it often feels that way with working with your advisors and having to have them supervise or check off every little thing of a given project. There are no grades, so after I finished my coursework for the last years of the PhD, I didn't get any grades, or I've still not got any grades. I just have to do well working in teams, working with others, working with advisors, and doing my research. So there's no like point or percentage to tell me like how good it is. The most common activity is cutting and pasting. So definitely cutting and pasting pieces of articles into notes that I'm writing to then combine my ideas to write a paper or something. That's pretty frequent. So it's definitely a different cutting and pasting, highlighting things in a computer, but still the same. And everybody's crying for their mommy. So hopefully that's not happening at kindergarten. Maybe preschool. This might fit better for preschool. I feel like preschools more often have nap time. But it can be a tough process going through the PhD. But we'll talk about that more in detail for the next in the next chapter. Really, right here, we're going to talk what is a PhD, what kind of jobs are you going to get with a PhD. So clinical focused PhD will give you that clinical practice training, and you'll be ready. You'll probably be specializing in a specific kind of disorder or specific kind of treatment to use after your PhD is done. And so we'll talk about choosing advisors, choosing programs, but it's really essential to choose a program that fits what you want to be doing, because you might be getting trained to treat people with PTSD. But if that's not what you want to do, that's not the program or the advisor you want to be working with. So you'll be getting trained with that clinical practice, as well as how to do research, how to do science around treatment programs that work. So the other degree in psychology that's doctoral level is called the PsyD. And so this is fairly new in relation to these other degrees. It is much more clinically focused. So there is some background of research, but not nearly as much as a PhD. So you'll be reading research, but most of these programs in a PsyD program aren't expecting you to create your own original research, but you will be having more time, more clinical exposure in the PsyD program. So with that, I think the only PsyDs that exist are in clinical psychology. They might also have PsyDs in counseling psychology as well, though. But essentially, it's very applied for clinical focus work with a doctoral level training. So the kind of clinical exposure that you're going to get in both of these is plenty and sufficient to work with people in clinical settings. So PsyD as well as PhD in a clinical focus. A PhD in developmental psychology, you might not train to actually work with young people to implement developmental interventions. You might be training to do research on the development of children. You might be doing longitudinal studies in your career or something like that. So remember, psychology is a lot more than simply doing therapy. So there is another doctoral level education or doctoral level degree that's similar to these, and this is the Doctor of Education. It is clinically oriented, but it's not focused on more what you might call severe forms of dysfunction. So you'll be training in the things you might generally see in a high school, middle school, elementary school, higher education setting. So you're not going to be training on like DID, schizophrenia. So you'll be focused more on probably things that more people that are more common. So anxiety, depression, things like that. And Doctor of Education, you could in this be training to, and with this, when applying to a Doctor of Education program, most often they want people with a master's degree to come into them. I didn't mention this before, but for PhDs and PsyDs, at least in psychology, in some other fields it's a little different. In psychology, for the PhD and PsyD programs, oftentimes these programs want you to come in just after bachelor's, and you'll get a master's degree on the way to your PhD or on the way to your PsyD, but most of them want you to come straight in from bachelor's training, basically so they can mold you exactly the way they want you. So they can start off your graduate level training exactly how they see fit in their program. It also keeps you going there for additional years and giving them more money. But really that's their purpose, is to train you in their specific method from the beginning. So get you a master's on the way to a PsyD or a PhD, versus the Doctor of Education degree, they more often take people with master's degree. And that being said, it's not like the programs in a PhD or a PsyD will not accept people with a master's degree. It's just generally they'll say, we prefer you to apply with a bachelor's. But you'll see that on like their application information. Some of them don't care and would also happily take people with masters. I don't know that there's any that have it like as a hard and fast rule that they definitely don't take master's degrees. It's just like they prefer people to come in with just a bachelor's. So if you want to do something like school counseling, school psychology, even developmental psychology, a Doctor of Education degree could be really great. that would get you really good training specifically within the education system itself. So whether it's higher education, public education, private education, that kind of work and research is what you're going to be doing getting the Doctor of Education degree. So often working in education settings, you might be working in nonprofits, public schools, colleges. So that's pretty common for someone with a Doctor of Education degree. So here are the acceptance rates for master's and doctorate programs. So the percent admitted is the taller number. So for school psychology, 60% for master's program, 31% for doctorate programs. Neuroscience or biological science, PhD, a doctorate program, only 11% acceptance rate, and this is across schools. This isn't just one single school. But you can see for a clinical psych program, if that's what you want to do for a PhD, it's got a very low acceptance rate, similar to social personality. These programs are some of the most popular, clinical as well as social. So it can be really, really competitive. Depending on the school, it's much harder to get into a clinical or social psych PhD than it is to get into one of the medical degrees in that school. So just keep that in mind. For some of these, it's not so difficult. For school psychology, there's a higher acceptance rate, but for many schools across the US, it is actually more difficult to get into a clinical psych PhD or a social personality or social PhD than even getting into the medical field. So, and that's always kind of held up there as like, it's really hard to get into medical school. It can be harder to get into clinical and social PhD programs. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about how to write your applications, what skills you want to build, what master's degrees you want to go for, those kinds of things, so that you can show, especially if you want to go into clinical and social, that you have the kind of capacity to do the work that's going to be required in a clinical or social PhD program. PsyDs are not quite as, they have a slightly higher acceptance rate than clinical PhD programs, but it still is not up to 31%. I don't remember offhand what the percent is. So let's talk about, just really briefly, the different kinds of degrees and kind of schools of psychology. And hopefully you remember a lot of this from your general psych class, because we go over this in general psych as well. So I've mentioned clinical psychologists a couple different times. Oftentimes, a clinical psychologist is going to be in charge of people with more, what we might call more severe disorders, so things like DED or DID or schizophrenia. You'd probably be a clinical psychologist working with those individuals. You'd be trained on testing for these things, so you can narrow down what is the classification of what this person is suffering from, then creating a treatment plan. So that's what a clinical psychologist is going to be doing. Probably if you're a clinical psychologist, you'll also be trained in various therapeutic techniques as well. Cognitive psychologists really focus on how we think, how we reason, make decisions, how memory works. This is also related to like perception, things like that. So a lot of research might be in how to help people have active cognition into adulthood. You can do applied or basic work in this, so looking to do research just for theory and understanding, or you can do really applied work to help people improve their cognition. So for all of these, there's probably both applied and basic research things. As well, you could get a master's in cognitive psychology and get, generally master's degrees are a little more application focused versus, again, a PhD is more research focused, which your research could be application. You could be researching the application of new things. Versus the master's level degree, you'd be learning about the applications that have been created and learning how to implement them. So a community psychologist looks at the systems around a community. So think of like your local city, what kinds of policies are in place, what kind of support systems are there. So it's a really useful position to help bring people together within the community to offer support for individuals. Counseling psychologist is focused on doing the counseling work, so a lot of training in the research on counseling techniques. So you can see some of these have a lot of overlap too. You could be a counseling psychologist but have a cognitive psychologist psychology focus, right? So a lot of times they'll be working with clients. A counseling psychologist would maybe be working with people with anxiety or depression, versus a clinical psychologist would probably be focusing and more specialized on specific kinds of disorders, versus counseling psychologist is a little more generalized for a lot of different disorders. A developmental psychologist looks at development across the entire lifespan. So again, this can be applied, this can be just research. So working with children, working with adolescents, working with adults, working with late adults, researching people at those points, how to help them improve their cognitive abilities. So there again is a lot of overlap between developmental and some of these other. Also developmental disorders and interventions would fit here too. Educational psychologist, this goes a lot to that educational Doctor of Education degree, but specifically how teachers and students in classrooms can all interact to help benefit students and student learning. You'll probably learn about like Vygotsky, things like this. So engineering or human factors psychologist, you might see this put under the banner of industrial organizational psychologist as well, but this would be specifically how like a machine and a human interact with each other. So if you wanted to design a car to help a driver focus on the road, you would talk to an engineering psychologist to be able to figure out how to help people focus and not run over motorcyclists, for example. So a funny story about that. One of my advisors, one of the faculty I took classes from, was Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he wrote a lot on flow. Essentially, this isn't going to be a long lecture on flow. Definitely watch one of his TED Talks or read one of his books. But essentially the experience of flow is when you are really present in the moment and you're matching like your engagement and your skill level. So you're really present, time seems to go really quickly but also really slowly. It's an enjoyable experience. Oftentimes you do really good, say, work if you're in flow during work, or you perform really well at whatever activity you're doing. And so a company hired him to make a flow car, a car to help people get into flow. And essentially he tried to explain to them that, and there might have been language barriers because of the car company that it was and where he was meeting with them. So there may have been language barriers. But what they were trying to get at was a car interior that was very luxury and made you feel calm and felt like you were at a flowing like ocean or river. That's what their idea was. And that's not what flow is. A mountain climber climbing a mountain during a competition might be in flow. A high-level tennis player is probably in flow during the Olympics. A race car driver is probably in flow when they're matching their skill to the difficulty level and really engaged in the activity you're doing. You don't want general everyday drivers to necessarily be in flow. You want them not to be pushing their skills that much in everyday driving. An example of this would be when you started driving, you were probably really stressed out. Like when you were first learning to drive when you were 16, your stress level was probably high because your skill was very low. At some point, they probably matched. And now your skill is probably much higher and the stress for driving is probably low because you've got more skills than are needed for day-to-day driving. So we really don't actually want people to have flow experiences in their cars unless they are a race car driver. So just kind of an interesting engineering psychology feature. This company was like, maybe we should put buttons for like smells so they can smell what's outside or something like that. It's like that's not actually what flow is. So there was clearly some misunderstanding there. With this, smells outside, let's go to environmental psychologists. Environmental psychologists look at the systems that are affecting the environment, how the environment is affecting humans, human behavior, how humans think, how humans can do things like reduce pollution and waste. There's a really good study, a really good example of an interrupted time series design study that was looking at a garbage collection program and tried to help a community produce less garbage. That kind of study would be a really good one for an environmental psychologist to do. It's also very applied. So let's try this proposal. In this case, it was rather than picking up garbage every day, which is what they were doing, they were going to stop garbage collection 1 day a week. Hopefully, if people saw the garbage piling up in their houses, they would understand the garbage is piling up in our country. So we need to stop producing so much garbage. That intervention didn't actually work, but later interventions actually did because of the work environmental psychologists did. And the environment is kind of important to humans. So experimental psychologists really focus on doing experiments. So you're really well trained on methods and how to do like randomized control trials. So if that's what you want to do and it's not a specific single area that you want to do experiments in, you want to be a master of doing experiments, this would be a good field to go into. Forensic psychologists, a lot of what they're doing is actually providing expert testimony about how psychology is related to the behaviors of different people in various cases. A lot of things with child custody. There's a lot of shows about like forensic psychologists like going to a crime scene and doing things. That's very little of what forensic psychologists do. The shows make it look more actively involved in that investigation side of things than it really is. It's a lot more like the back end kind of things. Health psychologists would work with other healthcare professionals, similar to, say, a community psychologist, bringing people together for the health and benefit of people. Industrial organizational psychologists try to make a workplace better, make teams work better, have morale be high, help managers communicate better with the employees, help employees get the things that they need, and help make organizations, companies, nonprofits do a better job at building the company up in a positive way and helping increase the well-being of the employees as well. So military psychologists could have a lot of these different kinds of jobs and do a lot of different research in that kind of area. So this is another one that kind of overlaps with a lot of different ones. You're a psychologist specifically within military context. You might be doing something like forensic psychology or community psychology or health psychology or clinical psychology within this position. Neuropsychologists would probably be working with other medical researchers, biologists in studying the brains, traumatic brain injury, cognitive capacities. So neuropsychologists might also be a cognitive psychologist as well. Personality psychologists look at the characteristics or traits that a person has for predicting behaviors, for assessing people's personality, for maybe personality disorders as well. They might be testing new measures. A positive psychologist focuses on things like meaning, purpose, happiness, and well-being, trying to help people and communities and institutions thrive. So positive psychology kind of has a lot of overlap with developmental psychology, with community psychology, with health psychology. So we just talked about flow a second ago. Flow grew out of positive psychology. Quantitative psychologist is an emphasis in doing quantitative methods. Maybe you have a lot more expertise in the statistics themselves. I like to always when I run my stats, I like to get someone who's better trained in quantitative psychology to double check what I've done essentially. So just to make sure I did things right. So doing a lot of data analysis, a lot of your work as a quantitative psychologist might be being on. There's a lot of quantitative psychologists who are authors on tons of papers, because essentially a researcher might come to you and say, hey, you're a quantitative psychologist, can you please run these stats and then write up the results for me? So a lot of quantitative psychologists are authors on tons and tons of papers because they've written the results section for tons and tons of papers. They weren't involved in like the methods of the paper. Some of them were. But yeah, it's a good way to get a lot of author credits. Rehabilitation psychologists, again, this is one of those that overlaps with things like community and health and clinical and counseling. School psychologists, we've talked about that already as well. Social psychologists focus more on small and large groups. When your group gets large enough, you look at sociology or even anthropology as well, but there's also a lot of overlap from social psychology and developmental psychology, because the groups will affect an individual can affect a group. Sports psychology, focusing on athletes specifically achieving their goals, maybe working with physical therapists, all sorts of things like that. And you'll generally find that any psychologist that you meet with a master's level training or a doctoral level training is a mix of a few types of these psychologists. So you probably won't find someone that's just a personality psychologist. That might be their main thing, but their personality and social and community psychologist would be a pretty good mix of a couple different things that are very overlapping. So if one or two of these topics interest you, think about how they might fit together. Look for programs, master's programs or doctoral programs, that have faculty members that are, say, clinical, counseling, and community psychologists, if that's where your focus is. If you want to mix developmental and social psychology, make sure you're going to a place with faculty that are developmental psychologists and social psychologists. Right? So look at the programs, look at the people that you're going to be training under to make sure you're getting the kind of training that you want. So think about the topics that interest you, figure out a way to mix them together well, and look for programs that will give you that kind of training. So with this, you might find a new way to connect things that's unique among those professionals, but you'll probably be able to find a program that fits what you want to do pretty well. So, and that'll help guide you to what kind of training, which program you should really settle down on. So if you've got 4 different programs, but this one is really the best one to train you in the multiple dimensions of psychology you want to get trained on, then pick that one. So with this being said, which of these types of psychologists would you guess that I am, that Professor Riches is? So take a minute, pause the video, maybe scroll back through those slides, and write down which types of psychologist you think I am, and I'll give you a moment to let you pause, and then I'll let you know. So what type of psychologist is Professor Riches? So I have a couple very overlapping interests, which hopefully you've seen by this time in the class. These aren't labeled in order of importance or interest, they're just kind of all of them together. So one is positive psychologist. My PhD is positive developmental psychology. So positive and developmental. I think my master's is just in psychology, that's the title of it, but it was the same program. So positive psychology, I'm trying to help people thrive in my research. I'm also a developmental psychologist. Most of my work focuses on between about the ages of like 12 and 35 or so, but I know a lot about development across the whole lifespan. So my own research is basically focused in adolescence, early adulthood time. But yeah, developmental psychology. Quantitative psychologists. A lot of training in statistics, a lot of training in methods, so that because I'm wanting to do applied studies to test things to help people thrive at that specific time in their development and across the lifespan. And a community psychologist. So this is one thing that I'm really working to do more, is work with people in the community, bring together different people who have different expertise to do these things, to help people thrive, essentially. So those are a couple of them. I would say even social psychology would be another one I could add there. But yeah, there's a couple of the interests in psychology I have and the type of psychologist I am. I don't feel like most psychologists now don't fit under just one. There's some kind of mix of all of them. So figure out what mix are of interest to you and find a program that can support you in getting that training to be the kind of psychologist that you want to do or that you want to be. So that is all for the brief overview of the types of jobs that you can get in with a master's or doctoral level training. In chapter 12, we'll talk more specifically about what to expect from a master's program, what to expect within a doctoral program, and some choices that you should make in deciding which kind of program to take. We'll go into a lot more detail for that.